The Return by Walter de la Mare. Chapter 8. The Sabbath, pale with September sunshine and monotonous with chiming bells, had passed languidly away. Dr. Simon had come and gone, optimistic and urbane, yet with a faint inward dissatisfaction over a patient behind whose taciturnity a hint of mockery and subterfuge seemed to lurk. Even Mrs. ʟɪᴏᴏᴏ had appeared to share her husband's reticence. But Dr. Simon had happened on other cases in his experience where tact was required rather than skill, and time than medicine. The voices and footsteps, even the frou-frou of worshippers going to church, the voices and footsteps of worshippers returning from church, had floated up to the patient's open window. Sunlight had drawn across his room in one pale beam and vanished. A few callers had called. Hothouse flowers, waxen and pale, had been left with messages of sympathy. Even Dr. Critchard had respectfully and discreetly made inquiries on his way home from chapel. Lawford had spent most of his time in pacing to and fro in his soft slippers. The very monotony had eased his mind. Now and again he had lain motionless with his face to the ceiling. He had dozed and had awakened cold and torpid with dream. He had hardly been aware of the process, but every hour had done something, it seemed, towards clarifying his point of view. A consciousness had begun to stir in him that was neither that of old Easy Lawford, whom he had never been fully aware of before, nor of the strange, ghostly intelligence that haunted the hawk-like, restless face and plucked so insistently at his distracted nerves. He had begun in a vague fashion to be aware of them both, could in fashion discriminate between them, almost as if there really were two spirits in stubborn conflict within him. It would, of course, wear him down in time. There could be only one end to such a struggle. The end. All day he had longed for freedom on and on, with cravings for the open sky, for solitude, for green silence beyond these maddening walls. This heedful silken coming and going, these Sunday voices, this reiterant yelp of a single peevish bell, would they never cease? And above all, betwixt dread and almost physical greed, he hungered for night. He sat down with elbows on knees and head on his hands, thinking of night, its secrecy, its immeasurable solitude. His eyelids twitched. The fire before him had for an instant gone black out. He seemed to see slow gesturing branches, grass stooping beneath a grey and wind-swept sky. He started up, and the remembrance of the morning returned to him. The glassy light, the changing rays, the beaming gilt upon the useless books. Now, at last, at the windows, afternoon had begun to wane. And when Sheila brought up his tea, as if chance had heard his cry, she entered in hat and stole. She put down the tray and paused at the glass, looking across it out of the window. Alice says you are to eat every one of those delicious sandwiches, and especially the tiny omelette. You have scarcely touched anything today, Arthur. I am a poor one to preach, I am afraid, but you know what that will mean. A worse breakdown still. You really must try to think of us all. Are you going to church? He asked in a low voice. Not, of course, if you would prefer not, but Dr. Simon advised me most particularly to go out at least once a day. You must remember, this is not the beginning of your illness. Long-continued anxiety, I suppose, does tell on one in time. Anyhow, he said that I looked worried and run down. I am worried. Let us both try, for each other's sakes, or even if only for Alice's, to do all we can. I must not harass you, but is there any... Do you see the slightest change of any kind? You always look pretty, Sheila. Tonight you look prettier. That is the only change, I think. Mrs. Lawford's attitude intensified in its stillness. Now, speaking quite frankly, what is it in you suggests these remarks at such a time? That's what baffles me. It seems so childish, so needlessly blind. I'm very sorry, Sheila, to be so childish, but I'm not. Say what you like, blind. You are pretty. I'd repeat it if I was burning at the stake. Sheila lowered her eyes softly onto the rich-toned picture in the glass. Supposing, she said, watching her lips move, supposing, of course. I know you are getting better and all that. But supposing you don't change back as Mr. Bethany thinks, what will you do? Honestly, Arthur, when I think of it calmly, the whole tragedy comes back on me with such a force that sweeps me off my feet. I am for the moment scarcely my own mistress. What would you do? I think, Sheila, replied a low, infinitely wary voice, I think I should marry again. It was the same wavering, faintly ironical voice that had slightly discomposed Dr. Simon that same morning. Marry again? Exclaimed incredulously the full lips in the looking-glass. Who? You, dear. Sheila turned softly around, conscious in a most humiliating manner that she had ever so little blushed. Her husband was pouring out his tea, unaware, apparently, of her change of position. She watched him, curiously. In spite of all her reason, of her absolute certainty, she wondered ever again for a moment if this really could be Arthur. And for the first time she realized the power and mastery of that eager and far too hungry face. Her mind seemed to pause, fluttering in air like a bird in the wind. She hastened, rather unsteadily, to the door. Will you want anything more, do you think? For an hour? She asked. Her husband looked up over his little table. Is Alice going with you? Oh yes, poor child, she looks so pale and miserable. We're going to Mrs. Sherwin's and then on to church. You will lock your door? Yes, I will lock my door. And I do hope, Arthur, nothing rash? A change that seemed almost the effect of actual shadow came over his face. I wish you would stay with me, he said slowly. I don't think you have any idea what I go through. It was as if a child had asked on the verge of terror for a candle in the dark. But an hour's terror is better than a lifetime of timidity. Sheila sighed. I think, she said, I too might say that. But there, giving away will do nothing for either of us. I shall be gone only for an hour, or two at the most, and I told Mr. Bethany I should have to come out before the sermon. There's only Mr. Craig. But why Mrs. Sherwin? She'd worm a secret out of one's grave. It's useless to discuss that, Arthur. You have always consistently disliked my friends. It's scarcely likely that you would find any improvement in them now. Oh, well, he began, but the door was already closed. Sheila, he called in a burst of anger. Well, Arthur? You have taken my latchkey. Sheila came hastily in again. Your latchkey? I am going out. Going out? Do not be so mad, so criminal. And after your promise. He stood up. It is useless to argue. If I do not go out, I shall certainly go mad. As for criminal, why, that's a woman's word. Who on earth is to know me? It is of no consequence, then, that the servants are already gossiping about this impossible Dr. Fergusson, that you are certain to be seen either going or returning, that Alice is bound to discover that you are well enough to go out, and yet not even enough to say good night to your own daughter. Oh, it's monstrous. It's a frantic and a heartless thing to do. Her voice vaguely suggested tears. Lawford eyed her coldly and stubbornly, thinking of the empty room he would leave awaiting his return, its lamp burning, its fire flames shining. It was almost a physical discomfort, this longing unspeakable for the twilight of the green secrecy and the silence of the graves. Keep them out of the way, he said in a low voice. It will be dark when I come in. His hardened face lit up. It's useless to attempt to dissuade me. Why must you always be hurting me? Why do you seem to delight in trying to estrange me? Husband and wife faced each other across the clear-lit room. He did not answer. For the last time, she said in a quiet, hard voice, I ask you not to go. He shrugged his shoulders. Ask me not to come back, he said. That's nearer your hope. He turned his face to the fire. Without moving, he heard her go out, return, pause, and go out again. And when he deliberately wheeled round in his chair, the little key lay conspicuous there on the counterpane. Chapter 9. The last light of sunset lay in the west, and a sullen rack of cloud was mounting into the windless sky when Lawford entered the country graveyard again by its dark, weather-worn lich gate. The old stone church with its square tower stood amid trees, its eastern window faintly aglow with crimson and purple. He could hear a steady, rather nasal voice through its open lattices, but the stooping stones and the cypresses were out of sight of its porch. He would not be seen down there. He paused a moment, however. His hat was drawn over his eyes. He was shivering. Far over the harvest fields showed a growing pallor in the sky. He would have the moon to go home by. Home. These trees, this tongueless companionship, this heavy, wine-like air, this soundless turf, these, in some obscure, desolate fashion, seemed far rather rarely home. His eyes wandered towards the fading crimson, and with that on his right hand he began softly, almost on tiptoe, descending the hill. It seemed to him that the steady eyes of the dead were watching him in his slow progress. The air was echoing with little faint, clear calls. He turned and snapped his fingers at a robin that was stalking him with its stony twittering from bush to bush. But when, after some little time, he actually came out of the narrow avenue and looked down, his heart misgave him, for someone was already sitting there on his low and solitary seat beneath the cypresses. He stood, hesitating, gazing steadily and yet half vacantly at the motionless figure, and in a while the face was lifted in his direction, and undisconcerted eyes calmly surveyed him. "I am afraid," called Lawford rather nervously, "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all, not at all," said the stranger. "I have no privileges here, at least as yet." Lawford again hesitated, then slowly advanced. "It's astonishingly quiet and beautiful," he said. The stranger turned his head to glance over the fields. "Yes, it is very," he replied. There was the faintest accent, a little drawl of unfriendliness in the remark. "You often sit here?" Lawford persisted. The stranger raised his eyebrows. "Oh, yes, often," he smiled. "It is my own modest fashion of attending divine service. The congregation is rapt." "My visits," said Lawford, "have been very few. In fact, so far as I know, I have only once been here before." "I envy you the novelty." There was again the same faint, unmistakable antagonism in voice and attitude, and yet so deep was the relief in talking to a fellow creature who had the least suspicion of anything unusual in his appearance that Lawford was extremely disinclined to turn back. He made another effort, for conversation with strangers had always been a difficulty to him, and advanced towards the seat. "You mustn't, please, let me intrude upon you," he said, "but really, I am very interested in this queer old place. Perhaps you would tell me something of its history." He sat down. His companion moved slowly to the other side of the broken gravestone. "To tell you the truth," he replied, picking his way as if it were from word to word, "its history, as people call it, does not interest me in the least. After all, it's not when a thing is, but what a thing is that much matters. What this is," he glanced with head bent across the shadowy stones, "is pretty evident. Of course, age has its charms." "And is this very old?" "Oh yes, it's old, right enough, as things go. But even age, perhaps, is mainly an affair of the imagination. There's a tombstone near that little old hawthorn, and there are 2 others side by side under the wall, still even legibly late 17th century. That's pretty good weathering." He smiled faintly. "Of course, the church itself is centuries older, drenched with age, but she's still sleepwalking while these old tombstones dream. Glowworms and crickets are not such bad bedfellows." "What interested me most, I think," said Lawford haltingly, "was this." He pointed with his stick to the grave at his feet. "Ah, yes, ʟɪᴏᴏᴏ," said the stranger. "I know his peculiar history almost by heart." Lawford found himself staring with unusual concentration into the rather long and pale face. "Not, I suppose," he resumed faintly, "not, I suppose, beyond what's there?" His companion leant his hand on the old stooping tombstone. "Well, you know, there's a good deal there," he stooped over. "If you read between the lines. Even if you don't." "A suicide," said Lawford under his breath. "Yes, a suicide. That's why our Christian countrymen have buried him outside of the fold. Dead or alive, they try to keep the wolf out." "Is this, then, unconsecrated ground?" said Lawford. "Haven't you noticed," drawled the other, "how green the grass grows down here, and how very sharp the poor old sapphire thorns? Besides, he was a stranger, and they kept him out." "But surely," said Lawford, "was it so entirely a matter of choice? The laws of the church? If he did kill himself, he did." The stranger turned with a little shrug. "I don't suppose it's a matter of much consequence to him. I fancied I was his only friend." "May I venture to ask why you are interested in this poor old thing?" Lawford's mind was as calm and shallow as a mill pond. "Oh, a rather unusual thing happened to me here," he said. "You say you often come?" "Often," said the stranger rather curtly. "Has anything ever occurred?" "Occurred?" He raised his eyebrows. "I wish it had. I come here simply, as I have said, because it's quiet, because I prefer the company of those who never answer me back, and who do not so much as condescend to pay me the least attention." He smiled and turned his face towards the quiet fields. Lawford, after a long pause, lifted his eyes. "Do you think," he said softly, "it is possible one ever could?" "One ever could?" "Answer back?" There was a low, rotting wall of stone encompassing ʟɪᴏᴏ's grave. On this, the stranger sat down. He glanced up rather curiously at his companion. Seldom the time, and the place, and the revenant altogether. "The thought has occurred to others," he ventured to add. Of course," said Lawford eagerly. "But it is an absolutely new one to me. I don't mean that I have never had such an idea, just in one's own superficial way, but—" He paused and glanced swiftly into the fast thickening twilight. "I wonder, are they, do you think, really all quite dead?" "Call and see," taunted the stranger softly. "Ah, yes, I know," said Lawford. "But I believe in the resurrection of the body. That is what we say, and supposing when a man dies, supposing it was most frightfully against one's will, that one hated the awful inaction that death brings, shutting up a poor devil up like a child kicking against the door in a dark cupboard, surely one might just quietly, try to get out Wouldn't you? He added. And surely, he found himself beginning gently to argue again, surely, what about, say, him? He nodded towards the old and broken grave that lay between them. What? ʟɪᴏᴏ? The other echoed, laying his hand upon the stone. And a sheer, enormous abyss of silence seemed to follow the unanswerable question. He was a stranger, it says so. Good God, said Lawford. How he must have wanted to get home. He killed himself, poor wretch. Think of the fret and the fever he must have been in just before. Imagine it. But it might, suggested the other with a smile. Might have been sheer indifference. Nicholas Sapphire, stranger to this parish. No, said Lawford, his heart beating as if it would choke him. I don't fancy it was indifference. It was almost too dark now to distinguish the stranger's features, but there seemed a faint suggestion of irony in his voice. And how do you suppose your angry, naughty child would set about it? It's narrow quarters. How would he begin? Lawford sat quite still. You say, I hope I am not detaining you, you say you have come here, sat here often on this very seat. Have you ever fallen asleep here? Why do you ask? Inquired the other curiously. I was only wondering, said Lawford. He was cold and shivering. He felt instinctively it was madness to sit on here in the thin, gliding mist that had gathered in swathes above the grass, milk pale in the rising moon. The stranger turned away from him. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come must give us pause, he said slowly, with a little satirical catch on the last word. What did you dream? Lawford glanced helplessly about him. The moon cast lean grey beams of light between the cypresses, but to his wide and wandering eyes it seemed that a radiance other than hers haunted these mounds and leaning stones. Have you ever noticed it? He said, putting out his hand towards his unknown companion. This stone is cracked from head to foot, but there. He rose, stiff and chilled. I am afraid I have bored you with my company. You came here for solitude, and I have been trying to convince you that we are surrounded with witnesses. You will forgive my intrusion. There was a kind of old-fashioned courtesy in his manner that he himself was dimly aware of. He held out his hand. I hope you will think nothing of the kind, said the other earnestly. How could it be in any sense an intrusion? It's the old story of Bluebeard, and I confess, I too should very much like a peep into his cupboard. Who wouldn't? But there, it's merely a matter of time, I suppose. He paused, and together they slowly ascended the path, already glimmering with a heavy dew. At the porch they paused once more, and now it was the stranger that held out his hand. Perhaps, he said, you will give me the pleasure of some day continuing our talk. As for our friend below, it so happens that I have managed to pick up a little more of his history than the sexton seems to have heard of, if you would care some time or other to share it. I live only at the foot of the hill, not half a mile distant. Perhaps you could spare the time now. Lawford took out his watch. "You are really very kind," he said, "but perhaps, well, whatever that history may be, I think you would agree that mine is even. But there, I've talked too much about myself already. Perhaps tomorrow?" "Why, tomorrow then," said his companion. "It's a flat, wooden house on the left-hand side. Come at any time of the evening." He paused again and smiled. "The third house after the rectory, which is marked up on the gate. My name is Herbert. Herbert, to be precise." Lawford took out his pocketbook and a card. "Mine," he said, handing it gravely to his companion, "is Lawford, at least." It was really the first time that either had seen the other's face at close quarters and clear lit, and on Lawford's a moon almost at the full shone dazzlingly. He saw an expression: dismay, incredulity, overwhelming astonishment start suddenly onto the dark, rather indifferent eyes. "What is it?" he cried, hastily stooping close. "Why," said the other, laughing and turning away, "I think the moon must have bewitched me too." Chapter 10. Lawford listened a while before opening his door. He heard voices in the dining room. A light shone faintly between the blinds of his bedroom. He very gently let himself in, and unheard, unseen, mounted the stairs. He sat down in front of the fire, tired out and bitterly cold in spite of his long walk home. But his mind was wearier even than his body. He tried in vain to catch up the thread of his thoughts. He only knew for certain that so far as his first hope and motives had gone, his errand had proved entirely futile. "How could I possibly fall asleep with that fellow talking there?" he had said to himself angrily, yet knew in his heart that their talk had driven every other idea out of his mind. He had not yet even glanced into the glass. His every thought was vainly wandering round and round the one curious hint that had drifted in, but which he had not yet been able to put into words. Supposing, though, that he had really fallen into a deep sleep, with none to watch or spy, what then? However ridiculous that idea, it was not more ridiculous, more incredible than the actual fact. If he had remained there, he might, it was just possible that he would by now, have actually awakened just his own familiar, everyday self again. And the thought of that, though he hardly realized its full import, actually did send him on tiptoe for a glance that more or less effectually set the question at rest. And there looked out at him, it seemed, the same dark sallow face that had so much appalled him only 2 nights ago. Expressionless, cadaverous, with shadowy hollows beneath the glittering eyes. And even as he watched it, its lips, of their own volition, drew together and questioned him. Whose? He was not to be given much leisure, however, for fantastic reveries like this. As he leaned his head on his hands, gladly conscious that he could not possibly bear this incessant strain for long, Sheila opened the door. He started up. "I wish you would knock," he said angrily. "You talk of quiet, you tell me to rest and think, and here you come creeping and spying on me as if I were a child in a nursery. I refuse to be watched and guarded and peeped on like this." He knew that his hands were trembling, that he could not keep his eyes fixed, that his voice was really inarticulate. Sheila drew in her lips. I have merely come to tell you, Arthur, that Mr. Bethany has brought Dr. Danton in to supper. He agrees with me it really would be advisable to take such a very old and prudent and practical friend into our confidence. You do nothing I ask of you. I simply cannot bear the burden of this incessant anxiety. Look, now what your night walk has done for you. You look positively at death's door. What an instinct you have for the right word, said Lawford softly, and Danton, of all people in the world, it was surely rather curious, a thoughtless choice. Has he had supper? Why do you ask? He won't believe. Too bloated. I think, said Sheila indignantly, it is hardly fair to speak of a very old and a very true friend of mine in such, well, vulgar terms as that. Besides, Arthur, as for believing, without in the least desiring to hurt your feelings, I must candidly warn you, some people won't. Come along, said Lawford, with a faint gust of laughter. Let's see. They went quickly downstairs, Sheila with less dignity perhaps than she had been surprised into since she had left a slimmer girlhood behind. She swept into the gaze of the two gentlemen standing together on the hearth-rug, and so was caught, as it were, between a rain of conflicting glances, for her husband had followed instantly, and stood now behind her, stooping a little, and with something between contempt and defiance confronting an old fat friend, whom that one brief challenging instant had congealed into a condition of passive and immovable hostility. Mr. Danton composed his chin in his collar, and deliberately turned himself towards his own companion. His small eyes wandered, and instantaneously met, and rested on those of Mrs. Lawford. Arthur thought he would prefer to come down and see you himself. You take such formidable risks, Lawford, said Mr. Bethany in a dry, difficult voice. Am I really to believe, Danton began huskily. I am sure, Bethany, you will. My dear Mrs. Lawford, said he, stirring vaguely, glancing restlessly. It was not my wish, Vicar, to come at all, said a voice from the doorway. To tell you the truth, I am too tired to care a jot either way, and he lifted a long arm. I must positively refuse to produce the least, the remotest proof that I am not, so far as I am personally aware, even the man in the moon. Danton, at your heart was always an incorrigible skeptic. Aren't you, T.D.? You pride your dear old brawn on it in secret. I rarely, began Danton in a rich, still voice. Oh, but you know you are, drawled on the slightly hesitating, long-drawn syllables. It's your parochial métier, firm, unctuous, subtle skepticism, and to that end your body flourishes. You were born fat, you became fat, and fat, my dear Danton, has been deliberately thrust on you in layers. Lampreys, you'll perish of surfeit some day of sheer Dantonism, and fat, post-mortem Danton. Oh, what a basting's there! Mr. Bethany, with a convulsive effort, woke. He turned swiftly on Mrs. Lawford. Why could you not have seen? He cried. It's no good, Vicar. She's all sheer Laodicean. Blow hot, blow cold, north, south, east, west. To have a weathercock for a wife is to marry the wind. There's nothing to be got from poor Sheila, but... Lawford. The little man's voice was as sharp as the crack of a whip. I forbid it. Do you hear me? I forbid it. Some self-command, my dear good fellow. Remember, it's only the will that keeps us breathing. Lawford peered as if out of a gathering dusk that thickened and flickered with shadows before his eyes. What's he mean, then? He muttered huskily, coming here with his black, still carcass, peeping. What's he mean, I say? There was a moment's silence. Then, with lifted brows and wide eyes that to every one of his 3 witnesses left an indelible memory of clear and wolfish light within their glassy pupils, he turned heavily and climbed back to his solitude. "I suppose," began Danton with an obvious effort to disentangle himself from the humiliation of the moment, "I suppose he was wondering." "Bless me, yes," said Mr. Bethany cordially. "Fever. We all know what that means." "Yes," said Danton, taking refuge in Mrs. Lawford's white and intent gaze. "Just think, Danton, the awful innocence and strain of such an ordeal. Think for an instant what such a thing means." Danton inserted a plump white finger between collar and chin. "Oh yes, but needlessly abusive. I never said I disbelieved him." "Do you?" said Mrs. Lawford's voice. He poised himself, as it were, on the monolithic stability of his legs. He said. Mr. Bethany sat down at the table. "I rather feared some temporary breakdown as this, Danton. I think I foresaw it. And now, just while we are all 3 alone here together in friendly conclave, wouldn't it be as well, don't you think, to confront ourselves with the difficulties? I know, we all know, that poor half-demented creature is Arthur Lawford. This morning he was as sane, as lucid as I hope I am now. An awful calamity has suddenly fallen upon him. This change. I own frankly at the first sheer shock it staggered me, as I think for the moment it has staggered Hugh. But when I had seen the poor fellow face to face, heard him talk, and watched him upstairs in the silence stir and awake and come up again to his trouble out of his sleep, I had no more doubt in my own mind and heart that he was he than I have in my mind that I am I. We do, in some mysterious way, you'll own at once, grow so accustomed, so inured, if you like, to each other's faces, masks though they be, that we hardly realize when we see them when we are speaking together. And yet, the slightest, the most infinitesimal change is instantly apparent." "Oh yes, Vicar, but you see." Mr. Bethany raised a small, lean hand. "One moment, please. I have heard Lawford's own account. Conscious or unconscious, he has been through some terrific strain, some such awful conflict with the unseen powers that we, thank God, have only read about, and never perhaps, until death is upon us, shall witness for ourselves. What more likely, more inevitable, than that such a thing should leave its scar, its cloud, its masking shadow? Call it what you will. A smile can turn a face we dread into a face we'd die for. Some experience, which would be nothing but hideous cruelty and outrage to ask too closely about, one, perhaps which he could, even if he would, poor fellow, give no account of, has put him temporarily at the world's mercy. They made him a 9 days' wonder, a byword. And that, my dear Danton, is just where we come in. We know the man himself, and it is to be our privilege to act as a buffer state, to be intermediaries between him and the rest of his dead, craving, sheepish world, for the time being. Oh yes, just for the time being. Other and keener and more knowledgeable minds than mine or yours will some day bring him back to us again. We don't attempt to explain. We can't. We simply believe." But Danton continued to stare, as if into the quiet of an aquarium. "My dear God, Danton," persisted Mr. Bethany with cherubic patience, "how old are you?" I don't see quite, smiled Danton with recovered ease and rapidly mobilizing forces. Excuse the confidence, Mrs. Lawford. I'm 43. Good, said Mr. Bethany, but I'm 71, and this child here, he pointed an accusing finger at Sheila, is youth perpetual. So, he briskly brightened. Say between us we're 60 all told, and can we, deliberately, with this mere pinch of years at our command, out of the wheeling millions that have gone, can we say this is impossible to any single phenomenon? Can we? Mr. Bethany rose cheerfully. All right, Danton, I am afraid you are exactly what the poor fellow in his delirium solemnly asseverated. And jesting apart, it is in delirium that we tell our sheer, plain, unadulterated truths. You're a nicely covered skeptic. Personally, I refuse to discuss the matter. Mere dull, stubborn prejudice, bigotry if you like. I will only remark just this, that Mrs. Lawford and I, in our inmost hearts, know. You, my dear Danton, forgive the freedom, merely incredulously grope. Faith versus reason, that prehistoric Armageddon. Some day, and a day not far distant either, Lawford will come back to us. This shutter will be taken down as abruptly as by some inconceivably drowsy heedlessness of common nature it has been put up. He'll win, though, and of his own sheer will and courage. But now, because I ask it and this poor child here entreats it, you will say nothing to a living soul about the matter, say, till Friday? What step-by-step creatures we are, to be sure. I say Friday because it will be exactly a week then. And what's a week? To nature, scarcely the unfolding of a rose. But still, then Friday be it. Then, if nothing has occurred, we shall have to call a friendly gathering. We shall be compelled to have a friendly consultation. I'm not, I hope, a brute, Bethany, said Danton apologetically, but honestly, speaking for myself, simply as a man of the world, it's a big risk to be taking on. What shall we call it? Or mere intuition? Personally, and even in a court of law, though heaven forbid it ever reaches that stage, personally, I could swear that the fellow that stood abusing me there in that revolting fashion was not Lawford. Could be easier even to believe in him if there were not that glaze, that shocking simulation of the man himself, the very man. But then, I am a skeptic, I own it, and upon my word, Mrs. Lawford, there's plenty of room for skeptics in a world like this. Very well, said Mr. Bethany crisply. That's settled then. With your permission, my dear, he added, turning untarnishably clear, childlike eyes on Sheila, I will take all risks, even to the foot of the gibbet, accessory Danton, after the fact. And so direct and cloudless was his gaze that Sheila tried in vain to evade it, and to catch a glimpse of Danton's small, agate-like eyes now completely under mastery, and awaiting confidently the meeting with her own. Of course, she said. I am entirely in your hands, dear Mr. Bethany. Chapter 11. Lawford slept far into the cloudy Monday morning to wake steeped in sleep, lethargic and fretfully haunted by inconclusive remembrances of the night before. When Sheila, with obvious and capacious composure, brought him his breakfast tray, he watched her face for some time without speaking. Sheila, he began, as she was about to leave the room again. She paused, smiling. Did anything happen last night? Would you mind telling me, Sheila? Who was it was here? Her lids the least bit narrowed. Certainly, Arthur. Mr. Danton was here. Then it was not a dream. Oh no, said Sheila. What did I say? What did he say? It was hopeless anyhow. I don't quite understand what you mean by hopeless, Arthur. And must I answer the other questions? Lawford drew his hand over his face like a tired child. He didn't believe? No, dear, said Sheila softly. And you, Sheila? Came the subdued voice. Sheila crossed slowly to the window. Well, quite honestly, Arthur, I was not very much surprised. Whatever we agreed about on the whole, you were scarcely yourself last night. Lawford shut his eyes and reopened them full on his wife's calm scrutiny, who had in that moment turned in the light of the one drawn blind to face him again. Who is? Always? No, said Sheila, but it was at least unfortunate. We can't, I suppose, rely on Dr. Bethany alone. Lawford crouched over his food. Will he blab? Blab? Mr. Danton is a gentleman, Arthur. Lawford rolled his eyes as if in temporary vertigo. Yes, he said, and Sheila once more prepared to make a reposeful exit. I don't think I can see Simon this morning. Oh, who then? I mean, I would prefer to be left alone. Believe me, I had no intention to intrude. And this time the door really closed. He is in a quiet, soothing sleep, said Sheila a few minutes later. Nothing could be better, said Dr. Simon, and Lawford, to his inexpressible relief, heard the fevered throbbing of the doctor's car reverse, and turned over and shut his eyes, dulled and exhausted in the still unfriendliness of the vacant room. His spirits had sunk, he thought, to their lowest ebb. He scarcely heeded the fragments of dreams, clear, green landscapes, amazing gleams of peace, the sudden broken voices, the rustling and calling shadowiness of subconsciousness, and this quiet sunlight of reality. The clouds had broken or had been withdrawn like a veil from the October skies. One thought alone was his refuge. One face alone haunted him with its peace. One remembrance soothed him. Alice. Through all his scattered and purposeless arguments, he strove to remember her voice, the loving kindness of her eyes, her untroubled confidence. In the afternoon, he got up and dressed himself. He could not bring himself to stand before the glass and deliberately shave. He even smiled at the thought of playing the barber to that lean chin. He dressed by the fireplace. I couldn't rest, he told Sheila, when she presently came in on one of her quiet, cautious, heedful visits, and one tires of reading even Quain in bed. Have you found anything? She inquired politely. Oh yes, said Lawford wearily. I have discovered that infinitely worse things are infinitely commoner, but that there's nothing quite so picturesque. Tell me, said Sheila with a refreshing naivety. How does it feel? Does it even in the slightest degree affect your mind? He turned his back and looked up at his broad gilt portrait for inspiration. Practically, not at all, he said hollowly. Of course, one's nerves, that fellow Danton, when one's overtired, you have. His voice, in spite of every effort, faintly quavered. You You haven't noticed anything? My mind? Me, oh dear, no. I never was the least bit observant, you know that, Arthur. But apart from that, and I hope you will not think me unsympathetic, but don't you think we must soon or later be thinking of what's to be done? At present, though I fully agree with Mr. Bethany as to the wisdom of hushing this unhappy business up as long as possible, at least from the gossiping outside world, still, we are only standing still. And your milady, dear, I suppose, isn't. You will help me, Arthur. You will try and think. Poor Alice. What about Alice? She mopes, dear, rather. She cannot, of course, quite understand why she must not see her father, and yet his not being, or, for the matter of that, even if he was, at death's door. At death's door, murmured Lawford under his breath. Who was it was saying that? Have you ever, Sheila, in a dream, or just as one's thoughts go sometimes, seen that door? Its ruinous stone lintel carved into lichenous stone heads, stonily silent in the last thin sunlight, hanging in peace unlatched, heated, hunted in agony in that cold, green-clad, shadowed porch is haven and sanctuary, but beyond, oh God, beyond. Sheila stood listening with startled eyes. And was all that in vain? She inquired rather flutteringly. Lawford turned a sidelong head and looked steadily at his wife. She shook herself with a slight shiver. Very well, then, she said, and paused in the silence. Her husband yawned and smiled, and almost as if it lit with that thin last sunshine, seemed the smile that passed for an instant across the reverie of his shadowy face. He drew a hand warily over his eyes. What has he been saying now? He inquired like a fretful child. Sheila stood very quiet and still, as if in fear of scaring some rare, wild, timid creature by the least stir. Who? She merely breathed. Lawford paused on the hearthrug with his comb in his hand. It's just the last rags of that beastly influenza, he said, and began vigorously combing his hair. And yet, simple and frank though the action was, it moved Sheila, perhaps more than any other of the congested occurrences of the last few days. Her forehead suddenly grew cold, the palms of her hands began to ache. She had to hasten out of the room to avoid revealing the sheer physical repulsion she had experienced. But Lawford, quite unmindful of the shock, continued in a kind of heedless reverie to watch, as he combed, the still visionary thoughts that passed in tranced stillness before his eyes. He longed beyond measure for freedom that until yesterday he had not even dreamed existed outside the covers of some old, impossible romance. The magic of the darkening sky, the invisible flocking presences of the dead, the shock of imaginations that had no words, of quixotic emotions which the stranger had stirred in that low, mocking, furtive talk beside the broken stones of the Huguenot. Was the change quite so monstrous, so meaningless? How often, indeed, he remembered curiously, had he seemed to be standing outside these fast-shut gates of thought, that now had been freely opened to him. He drew ajar the door and lent his ear to listen. From far away came a rich, long-continued chuckle of laughter, followed by the clatter of a falling plate, and then still more uncontrollable laughter. There was a faint smell of toast on the air, Lawford ventured out onto the landing and into a little room that had once, in years gone by, been Alice's nursery. He stood far back from the strip of open window that showed beneath the green blind, craning forward to see into the garden, the trees, their knotted trunks, and then, as he stole nearer, a flower bed, late roses, geraniums, calceolarias, the lawn, and, yes, 3 wicker chairs, a footstool, a work-basket, a little table on the smooth grass in the honey-coloured sunshine, and Sheila sitting there in the autumnal sunlight, her hands resting on the arms of her chair, her head bent, evidently deeply engrossed in her thoughts. He crept an inch or 2 forward and stooped. There was a hat on the grass, Alice's big garden hat, and beside it lay Flitters, nose on paws, long ears sagging. He had forgotten Flitters. Had Flitters forgotten him? Would he bark at the strange, distasteful scent of a Dr. Fergusson? The coast was clear then. He turned, even softlier yet, to confront, wrapped still and hovering betwixt astonishment and dread, the blue calm eyes of his daughter looking in at the door. It seemed to Lawford as if they had both been suddenly swept by some unseen power into a still, unearthly silence. "We thought," he began at last, "we thought just to beckon Mrs. Lawford from the window. He is asleep." Alice nodded. Her whole face was in a moment flooded with red. It ebbed and left her pale. "I will go down and tell Mother you wanted to see her. It was very silly of me. I did not quite recognize at first, I suppose thinking of my father." The words faltered, and the eyes were lifted to his face again with a desolate, incredulous appeal. Lawford turned away, heart-sick and trembling. Certainly, by no means," he began, listening vaguely to the glib patter that seemed to come from another mouth. "Your father, my dear young lady, I venture to think is now really on the road to recovery. Dr. Simon makes excellent progress, but of course, 2 heads we know are so much better than 1 when there's the least difficulty. The great thing is quiet, rest, isolation, no possibility of a shock else." His voice fell away. His eloquence failed. For Alice stood gazing stirlessly on and on into this infinitely strange, infinitely familiar, shadowy, phantasmal face. "Oh, yes," she replied. "I quite understand, of course, but if I might just peep even, I should be so much, much happier. Do let me just see him, Dr. Fergusson, with only his head on the pillow. I wouldn't even breathe. Couldn't it possibly help, even in a face cure?" She leant forward impulsively, her voice trembling and her eyes still shining beneath their faint, melancholy smile. "I fear, my dear, it cannot be. He longs to see you, but with his mind, you know, in this state, it might—" "But Mother never told me," broke in the girl desperately. "There was anything wrong with his mind. Oh, but that was quite unfair. You don't mean that." Lawford scanned swiftly the little square beloved in a memoried room that fate had suddenly converted for him into a cage of unspeakable pain and longing. Oh no, believe me, no. Not his brain, not that. Not even wondering, really, but always thinking, always longing on and on for you, dear. Only. Quite quite master of himself, but— "You talk," she broke in again angrily, "only in pretense. You are treating me like a child, and so does mother, and so it has been ever since I came home. Why, if mother can and you can, why may not I? Why, if he can walk and talk in the night?" "But who can walk and talk in the night?" inquired a low, stealthy voice out of the quietness behind her. Alice turned swiftly. Her mother was standing at a little distance with all the calm and moveless concentration of a waxwork figure, looking up at her from the staircase. I was talking to Dr. Fergusson, Mother. But as I came up the stairs, I understood you to be inquiring something of Dr. Fergusson. If you were saying he can walk and talk in the night, you surely were not referring to your father, child? That could not possibly be in his state. Dr. Fergusson, I know, will bear me out in that at least. And besides, I really must insist on following out medical directions to the letter. Dr. Fergusson, I know, will fully concur. Do pray, Dr. Fergusson, continued Sheila, raising her voice even now scarcely above a rapid murmur, do pray assure my daughter that she must have patience, that how much even he himself may desire it, it is impossible that she should see her father yet. And now, my dear child, come down. I want to have a moment's talk with Dr. Fergusson. I feared from his beckoning at the window that something was amiss. Alice turned, dismayed, and looked steadily, almost with hostility, at the stranger, so curiously transfixed and isolated in her small old playroom. And in this scornful yet pleading confrontation, her eye fell suddenly on the pin in his scarf, the claw and the pearl she had known all her life. From that, her gaze flitted like some wild demented things over face, hair, hands, clothes, attitude, expression, and her heart stood still in an awful, inarticulate dread of the unknown. She turned slowly towards her mother, groped forward a few steps, turned once more, stretching out her hands towards the vague, still figure whose eyes had called so piteously to her out of their depths, and fell fainting in the doorway. Lawford stood motionless, vacantly watching Sheila, who knelt, chafing the cold hands. "She has fainted," he said. "Oh, Sheila, tell me, only fainted?" Sheila made no answer, did not even raise her eyes. "Some day, Sheila," he began in a dull voice, and broke off, and without another word, without even another glance at the still face and blue twitching lids, he passed her rapidly by, and in another instant Sheila heard the house door shut. She got up quickly, and after a glance into the vacant bedroom, turned the key. Then she hastened upstairs for sal volatile at Eau de Cologne. It was yet clear daylight when Lawford appeared beneath the portico of his house. With a glance of circumspection that almost seemed to suggest a fear of pursuit, he descended the steps, only to be made aware in so doing that Ada was with a kind of furtive eagerness pointing out the mysterious Dr. Fergusson to a steadily gazing cook. One or two well-known and many a well-remembered face he encountered in the thin stream of city men treading blackly along the pavement. It was a still, high evening, and something very like a forlorn compassion rose in his mind at sight of their grave, rather pretentious, rather dull, respectable faces. he found himself walking with an affectation of effrontery, and smiling with a faint contempt on all alike, as if to keep himself from slinking and the wolf out of his eyes. He felt restless and watchful and suspicious, as if he had suddenly come down in the world. His, then, was a disguise as effectual as a shabby coat and a glazing eye. His heart sickened. Was it even worthwhile living on a crust of social respectability so thin and so exquisitely treacherous? He challenged no one. One or two actual acquaintances raised and lowered a faintly inquiring eyebrow in his direction. One even recalled in his confusion a smile of recognition just a moment too late. There was, it seemed, a peculiar aura in Lawford's presence, a shadow of a something in his demeanour that proved him alien. Nonetheless, Green Witherspoon kept calling him, much as a bell in the imagination tolls on and on in the echo of reality. If the worst should come to the worst, why, there is pasture in the solitary byways for the beast that strays. He quickened his pace along lonelier streets, and soon strode freely through the little flagged and cobbled village of shops, past the same small jutting window whose clock had told him the hour on that first dark, hurried night. All was pale and faint, with dying colours now, and decay was in the leaf, and the last swallows filled the gold air with their clashing stillness. No one heeded him here. He looked from side to side, exulting in the strangeness. Shops were left behind, the last milestone passed, and in a little while he was descending the hill beneath the elm boughs, which he remembered had stood like a turreted wall against the sunset when first he had wandered down to the churchyard. At the foot of the hill he passed by the green and white rectory, and there was the parson, a short, fat, pursy man with wrists protruding from his jacket sleeves as he stood on tiptoe, tying up a rambling rose shoot on his trim, seeded lawn. The next house barely showed its old red chimney tops above its bowers. The next was empty, with windows vacantly gazing, its paths peopled with great bearded weeds that stood mutely watching and guarding the seldom opened gate. Then came more lofty grandmotherly elms, a dense hedge of every leaf that pricks, and then Lawford found himself standing at the small canopied gate of the queer old wooden house that the stranger of his talk had in part described. It stood square and high and dark in a small amphitheatre of verdure. Roses here and there sprang from the grass, and a narrow box-edged path led to a small door in a low green-mantled wing, with its one square window above the porch. And while, with vacant mind, Lawford stood waiting, as one stands forebodingly upon the eve of a new experience, he heard, as if at a distance, the sound of falling water. He still paused on the country roadside, scrutinizing this strange, still wooden presence. But at last, with an effort, he pushed open the gate, followed the winding path, and pulled the old iron-hanging bell. There came presently a quiet tread, and Herbert himself opened the door, which led into a little square wood-panelled hall, hung with queer old prints and obscure portraits in dark frames. "Ah, yes. Come in, Mr. Lawford," he drawled. "I was beginning to be afraid you were not coming." Lawford laid hat and walking-stick on an oak bench and followed his churchyard companion up a slightly inclined corridor and a staircase into a high room, covered far up the yellowish walls with old books on shelves and in cases, between which hung in little black frames mezzotints, etchings, and antiquated maps. A large table stood a few paces from the deep alcove of the window, which was surrounded by a low, faded green seat, and was screened from the sunshine by wooden shutters. And here, the tranquil surge of falling water shook incessantly on the air, for the 3 lower casements stood open to the fading sunset. On a smaller table were spread cups, old earthenware dishes of fruit, and a big bowl of damask roses. Please, sit down. I shan't be a moment. I'm not sure that my sister is in, but if so, I will tell her we are ready for tea. Left to himself in this quiet, strange old room, Lawford forgot for a while everything else. He was for the moment so taken up with his surroundings. What seized on his fancy and strangely affected his mind was this incessant changing roar of falling water. It must be the widder, he said to himself, flowing close to the walls. But not until he had the boldness to lean head and shoulders out of the nearest window did he fully realize how close indeed the widder was. It came sweeping dark and deep and begreened and full with the early autumnal rains, actually against the lower walls of the house itself, and in the middle suddenly swerved in a black, smooth arch and tumbled headlong into a great pool, nodding with the tall, slender water beads, and charged in its bubbled blackness here and there with the last crimson of the setting sun. To the left of the house, where the waters floated free again, stood vast, still trees above the clustering rushes, and in glimpses between their spreading boughs lay the far-stretching countryside, now dimmed with the vast mists of approaching evening. So absorbed he became as he stood leaning over the wooden sill above the falling water, that eye and ear became enslaved by the roar and stillness. And in the faint atmosphere of age that seemed like a veil to hang about the odd old house and these prodigious branches, he fell into a kind of waking dream. When at last he did draw back into the room, it was perceptibly darker, and a thin, keen shaft of recollection struck across his mind, the recollection of what he was, and of how he came to be here, his reasons for coming, and of that dark, indefinable presence which like a raven had begun to build its dwelling in his mind. He sat on, his eyes restlessly wandering, his face leaning on his hands, and in a while the door opened, and Herbert returned, carrying an old crimson and a green teapot, and a dish of hot cakes. "They're all out," he said. "Sister, Sally, and boy. But these were in the oven, so we won't wait. I hope you haven't been very much bored." Lawford dropped his hands from his face and smiled. "I have been looking at the water," he said. "My sister's favorite occupation. She sits for hours and hours, with not even a book for an apology, staring down into the black old roaring pot. It has a sort of hypnotic effect after a time, and you'd be surprised how quickly one gets used to the noise. To me, it's even less distracting than sheer silence. You don't know, after all, what on earth sheer silence means, even at Witherstone. But one can just realize a water nymph. They chatter, but thank heaven it's not articulate." He handed Lawford a cup with a certain niceness and self-consciousness, lifting his eyebrows slightly as he turned. Lawford found himself listening out of a peculiar stillness of mind to the voice of this suave and rather inscrutable acquaintance. "The curious thing is, do you know," he began rather nervously, "that though I must have passed your gate at least twice in the least few months, I have never noticed it before, never even caught the sound of the water." "No, that's the best of it. Nobody ever does. We are just buried alive. We have lived here for years and scarcely know a soul, not even our own, perhaps. Why on earth should one? Acquaintances, after all, are little else than a bad habit. But then, what about me? Said Lawford. But that's just it, said Herbert. I said acquaintances. That's just exactly what I'm going to prove. What very old friends we are. You've no idea. It really is rather queer. He took up his cup and sauntered over to the window. Lawford eyed him vacantly for a moment, and, following rather his own curious thoughts than seeking any light on this somewhat vague explanation, again broke the silence. It's odd, I suppose, but this house affects me much in the same way as Witherstone does. I'm not particularly fanciful, at least I used not to be. But sitting here I hope it isn't a very frantic remark, it seems as though, if only my ears would let me, I should hear, well, voices. It's just what you said about the silence. I suppose it's the age of the place. It is very old? Pretty old, I suppose. It's worm-eaten and rat-eaten and tindery enough in all conscience, and the damp doesn't exactly foster it. It's a queer old shanty. There are 2 or 3 accounts of it in some old local stuff I have. And, of course, there's a ghost. A ghost? Echoed Lawford, looking